Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannick here with longtime panelist Christopher Zender. Today we discuss Catholicism and politics. In doing so, we'll also explore the current debate between integralism and post-liberalism. It's a tall order, but we have a welcome and returning guest, Thomas Storck, to help us. He's the author of several books, including a new edition of his Foundations of a Catholic Political Order. In addition, he recently translated and wrote a new foreword for Louis Cardinal Billot's Liberalism, a critique of its basic principles in various forms. Storck is a prolific writer and reviewer, and to top it off, he's an authority on distributism, as befits a member of the American Solidarity Party. Let's begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation through Christ our Lord. Amen. Tom, we better get started with some working definitions and keep our fingers crossed that they work. So, could you tell us just what liberalism is? And if you get that done, can you tell us about post-liberalism and integralism?
Well, let me quote from what I wrote a long time ago about liberalism, if I may. I wrote, this was back in 2000, liberalism is that general movement in Western civilization which has sought freedom from the restraints imposed by Christian teaching, and therefore has attacked Catholic culture, first on the level of Christian economic morality, secondly on the level of the political rights of God, and lastly on the level of the human person itself. And I would add that in there comes an attack on the family as well, which would become somewhere between the political and the personal. So in other words, liberalism is simply a feeling. It's not really an ideology that you can say liberalism holds this, because the liberals of 1810, say, and the liberals of 1910 would not have agreed on many, many things, let alone the liberals of 2010. But in each case, there was a feeling that we had to throw off restraints. The restraints differed depending on a lot of factors. And for example, in 1810, the liberals wanted to throw off economic restraints. They felt they were in favor of the free market and so on. So some people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo were definitely in the forefront of liberalism at the time. 100 years later, and liberals have changed, and they no longer favor the free market. And supposedly now they don't either, although they don't really care about that one way or the other. But liberalism is simply a desire to get rid of restraints, any restraints that don't flow from the individual person are seen as an oppression.
Let me just insert something here, and then Christopher can take us forward. You've defined liberalism in opposition to Christianity. Could there be within a Buddhist society something that commentators would quite naturally refer to as a liberal reform movement? Or could there be such a thing, say, within Islam, or say in classical Greek? Could we have a post-draconian turn towards a more liberal society?
Well, I think that depends. In the case of the pre-Christian Mediterranean civilization, many of the restraints that in the Middle Ages, for example, were placed on economic activity had their analogs in Greek and Roman society, where they saw economic activity, for example, as something that had to be related to the common good, not just a means of personal enrichment. As far as non-Western civilizations like Buddhism or Islam, well, Islam is a kind of a borderline case, but Buddhism, say, I think a lot of it depends on semantics. I mean, strictly speaking, if you want to, I don't know. I don't really know. I don't want to impose categories where they don't really belong either. So I have to say, in regard to, say, Asia, East Asian civilizations, I have to say, is it really legitimate to use that word liberal? I don't know. In regard to Islam, probably so, since Islam shares many characteristics with Christian civilization, being kind of an offspring of it.
All right, that helps clarify matters. Christopher, Tom owes us a couple more definitions. You want to push him on them?
Yeah, in terms of your definition on liberalism, first of all, what do you think the connection is between liberalism and individualism? Because it seems to me that one of the demands of liberalism, at least in the 19th century, was the liberation of the state from the church, right? So that seems like a corporate liberation. But much of liberalism has to do with the individual businessman, the individual, the man or the woman who wants to have sexual freedom, those sorts of things. So where do you think that falls? And maybe tie into that, maybe this would be a question addressing the idea of post-liberalism. Nowadays, we have what we consider basically a liberal society, but yet there are increasing demands for restrictions of freedom of expression on a number of people, such as people who might speak out against same-sex marriage or transgenderism, that type of thing. Where do you think the second part of the question is, where do you think post-liberalism fits into, or are we post-liberal, and how is what our current condition fit with what went before?
Well, the terminology that we use, or that you say in general journalistic discourse or even academic discourse, and what I would see as the underlying reality don't necessarily align completely. So, for example, people would talk about, oh yeah, we live in a liberal society, and by which they mean democracy, capitalism of some form or another, individual rights of free speech, and so on. I think that they're taking elements of liberalism and they're absolutizing them. Whereas I think that what a lot of people would call post-liberal, well, one form of post-liberalism would say wokeism and that kind of thing, is really just liberalism on steroids, if I may use that hackneyed phrase, because in every case they're trying to get rid of restraints. And the fact that, as I said before, a liberal of 1910, a liberal of 1810 wouldn't have agreed on many, many points. So the fact that we say, oh, we live in a liberal society and these people who are trying to repress free speech, they're anti-liberal. Well, yes, in one sense you could call them that, but I would say no, fundamentally, they're just a new form of liberals. That's why, for example, in the United States, what we call the conservatives, who are essentially just kind of 19th century liberal in their economic championing of economic freedom, are just as much liberal as, say, a 1940s New Dealer who wanted to restrain economic freedom for the common good.
So it seems you're defining liberalism as something essentially negative, removal of restraints. What is the good liberals are looking for? What are they seeking?
Well, it was very true that in the ancient regime, by and large, there were injustices, there were inequalities, there were instances where the nobility, for example, had rights that were totally ridiculous and allowed them to run roughshod over the peasantry at times, despite safeguards put in place to prevent that. So there was a kind of a resentment of certain things that were unreasonable. But instead of trying to correct those unreasonable restraints or unreasonable inequalities within the context, within the framework, I should say, within the framework of the Christian society that was left over from the Middle Ages, instead of trying to use that framework, they jettisoned it altogether and made freedom from restraint the principle that they work from.
So how does, it's interesting, because so it almost seems like they don't really have any particular good they're striving for. When you talk about integralism, I'm sure you'll talk about the common good, but it seems like at best the individual good is the good which they're striving for. But since individual goods can often contradict one another, there's really no clearly defined good to which liberalism strives.
Right, liberalism is not. It's very amorphous, and as I said, is negative. Yes, I would agree. What you said was just a negative impetus.
Okay. So you would think that what we call post-liberalism, despite the fact, for instance, many post-liberals seem to be hold to the papal doctrine that truth has no rights. I mean, error has no rights. It's still essentially liberalism.
Yeah, well, post-liberalism can mean a lot of different things, but if we're talking about the kind of post-liberalism that we might call wokeism, yeah, I think it's a form of liberalism, definitely. And just as the 1910s liberal would have said, well, no, laissez-faire economics, we have to put restraints on the freedom of conduct of industrialists and so on. Whereas an 1810 liberal would have said, "Oh, that's horrendous! How can you restrain these people from their freedom?" So nowadays, the wokest liberals, if I may use that term, would say, "Yeah, we have to restrain these people." And even though a 1950 liberal might have said, "Oh, we can't. We have to defend to the death the right to say anything," nonetheless, they're both forms of liberalism, as I see it.
And what about now, our third definition we need is integralism. What is that?
Well, strictly speaking, it simply what every Catholic should be, namely that we accept all the teachings of the Church, as Vatican I said, whether taught through the extraordinary or ordinary magisterium. The thing that makes integralism specific is that integralists are particularly interested in the Catholic teaching on the social order, and most particularly as these were restated and kind of codified, if you will, or summarized is a better word, I guess, by Pope Leo XIII in a series of encyclicals in the late 19th century, where he went over the relationship between the Church and the social order and the Church and the political order in considerable detail. And integralists look back on this as I think I would say it's a remarkable moment intellectually in the history of the Church, that we had somebody at the, well, I wouldn't say the beginning of modernity, but as modernity was getting going, who restated things so clearly. So integralism simply is, I suppose you'd say a Catholic integralist is somebody, is a Catholic who's Orthodox, but who particularly is focused on the Catholic teaching concerning the social, economic, and political order.
Now, would you say that Leo XIII, as an integralist, was a right-wing thinker?
I think those categories, right-wing and left-wing, need to be jettisoned as quickly as possible. Perhaps we can do it today. I can start a movement. No, as you know, as both of you know, those terms come from the accidental seating in the French National Assembly after the French Revolution. And they, aside from the total contingency of the way the seating was in the assembly, obviously, it presupposes that something as complicated as political philosophies can be put on a line so that you could simply say, oh yeah, he's more right than he, and he's more left than he is, and so on. Whereas the thickness, if you will, the complexity of most political positions really makes that impossible. So one of the things that frustrates me so much in our discourse is that we continue to use these right, left, conservative, liberal terms. I think they have no meaning. I think they're not even shorthand. They're not even useful. They obscure thinking. They make it more difficult.
I agree. Now, what you've got there, we see it on the screen as a file cabinet and then another file cabinet. And we could have those take the place of the dustbin of history. And you could file in there terms like liberal and conservative, left and right. That would be a place to store them. But then you'd have to get some more files pretty quickly. Well, we've been talking about freedom, chiefly in terms of negative freedom. But let's talk about government and the good. Does government, rightly understood, have a duty to bring it about that citizens are good citizens? Does it have a duty to promote the good? And if it does, what's the good?
Well, yes, it does. I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, was very clear about this, that the government has a duty to promote virtue. But as you said, in a gradual manner and taking account of the state of the people. So, for example, if you were a barbarian king in the year 600, you wouldn't suddenly propose the kind of criminal code that might have worked very well in, say, Ireland in 1930, where you had a virtuous people who were trained in centuries of Catholic morality, and it would have been different. So, yeah, the government does have a duty to promote the individual goodness and the common good too. Individual goodness obviously would be the moral law, virtue, and then the common good would be the good for society as a whole, and as a result of that, for every citizen, for every member of society, and would include it would include institutions, which is something that I think Americans don't see very clearly, that the institutions themselves, the laws, for example, or the organizations or the form in which we organize society, themselves have to promote the common good. It's not just a matter of saying, we need good people. No, yes, we do need good people, that's the sine qua non, but we also need good institutions, good framework, good political, legal framework for them to work within.
Should you push our guest, Christopher, should you push him to tell us more about the good, or do you want to push him away from that and on to something else? Good grief, after all.
Well, I think a lot of our listeners so far might still be wondering, what the hell is integralism? I mean, he's given a basic definition. Tom, you give a basic definition, but the details are a little murky right now. And our next question, actually, not only that, the past question we asked, do government leaders have a duty to make us better people? But the next question probably hits it right on the mark. Do governments have a duty to put society under the reign of Jesus Christ? I think that will show us where the integralists stand.
Yeah, Pope Leo was very, very, very clear about this, that just as an individual is under obligations to God, so when he joins with other individuals, no matter what kind of a society that might be, he's equally under obligations to God. Now, if you have an organization with a very limited aim, like say a sports club, well, they don't have to have prayer meetings or sponsor processions or anything like that, as long as they don't do anything against the law of God. But when you have an organization like the state, like civil society, that is basically is oriented toward the good of man at every level, then that organization has to acknowledge God explicitly. Now, does this hold for, say, the U.S. government nowadays or any other secular government? Well, not really, in the sense that it's an impossibility, and the duties of a liberal government to the common good are different from the duties of a Catholic government. But if you had a Catholic culture, and the people were virtuous enough that they saw this, then yes, the state, they would have a duty to put in the Catholic government that would explicitly honor Christ the King and order the society toward that, toward acceptance of God and its obligations toward God. But that doesn't really hold in any practical way, certainly for our society.
Do you think there's something, Pope Benedict XVI uses this term, healthy secularism? Do you think there's something that could be called healthy secularism? I would suppose the secularism he would be referring to there would be something different from what Leo XIII was calling for in terms of the relationship of the state to the church.
Well, I don't really know what he meant, what Benedict meant by that term, so I can't really say whether I agree with him or not. But I tend to think I guess I would be suspicious to think that no, I think he probably would differ from Leo, and I wouldn't agree with him. And what he was saying was kind of an innovation in Catholic thinking. But unless I saw the context of his statement, of Benedict's statement, it would be hard to comment definitively on that. I know that for example, in that 2005 address that Benedict made to the Curia, he said that there needed to be a new relationship between the church and modernity. And I have to respectfully say, I don't think so. I think Leo XIII, I mean, when the Leonine Project, which was a multifaceted project, not just on the social order, but on philosophy and theology, it brought about a remarkable era in the history of the church from, say, 1878 when he became Pope until, I mean, it didn't come to crashing to an end at any particular date, but it kind of petered out during and after the council. And it was a remarkable period in the history of the church where it seemed like the church was actually reversing modernity, the bad things about modernity. And modernity can mean a lot of different things, but in the case of secularization, let's say, that the church was actually seemed to be reversing that. And, you know, the church has had more respect. Converts were coming in of high quality. People were beginning to take the faith seriously. And that was all under this program of Leo of how to face the modern world, which nowadays, with so many people, even good Catholics, would think, oh, that's really hopeless. We could never do anything like that. Well, Leo tried, and look what it did. It did something good.
Let me introduce a couple of test cases. And I also want to say something about the best form of government, but let me start with a test case. In the Philippines, massive inroads in a substantially Catholic culture had been made by the drug trade. And in Catholic thought, great regard is shown to right reason. And if one is a drug addict, one's no longer capable of right reason. Now, along comes an elected leader, Duterte, who's known for ruthlessly prosecuting drug dealers, who make it impossible for people to make good choices, to exercise right reason. But Duterte doesn't have the kind of support at intermediate levels of government that's necessary, in his view, to really crack down on drug dealers. So extrajudiciously, he does that very thing. And the crackdown is such that it involves the regular paralegal execution of drug dealers. Now, he might say, this country of ours, which is so constricted by deep poverty, will never be able to make any progress unless we, at least first of all, root out the drug trade. And people call me a tyrant, but actually I'm operating to restore the conditions for a good society. What would we say? What would you say to somebody like Duterte who makes such an argument?
Well, I would say that the devil might be in the details. The notion that we can't use decisive action to promote the common good so much depends on the material conditions of the society, and on, as I said before, about the level of virtue, the traditions, and so on, and the corruption. I mean, if for example the judicial system is corrupt so that a drug dealer can easily buy an acquittal, then it might be necessary to get around it that way. I mean, if you look back at some of the early founders of medieval Europe, they weren't always exactly respecters of democratic norms. And I think that, as I said, well, the devil could be in the details. I'm certainly not going to go on record as saying I endorse everything he's doing, Duarte is doing. Some of them I don't even know, but I'm vaguely aware of what you're saying. But I think in principle, yes, but is he going too far in many cases? I don't know. Very likely he is. But it's very difficult. You have a difficult situation, and you don't. Justice is something that has to be preserved at all times, no matter what. But justice doesn't always mean that you have to go along with what we're accustomed to think of as due process, say. Not that you can execute people who are innocent. No, that would be a terrible thing. But do you have to take, 19th century notions of due process, we're violating them. Oh, that's horrible. Well, maybe 19th century notions of due process assumed the kind of society in which that wasn't necessary. But when you have a society that's sufficiently corrupted by, say, the drug traffic, then you might have to, without violating genuine justice, you might have to violate some of the liberal notions about due process and so on.
A quick comparison: we have Obrador in Mexico declaring in effect an end to the war on drugs. We're not going to, he says, vigorously address and prosecute the major cartel leaders. And then a postscript on this postscript. Trying to do so never succeeded anyway. But what we're going to do is change the social conditions so that people won't be so prone to escape in terms of drugs. Now, Obrador never claimed to be doing that as a Catholic, but it's an example of how one might take a very different approach to a society that is really teetering because of the drug industry. But now let me go back from Duterte and Obrador to Aquinas and the forms of government. In De Reino, which is a relatively early work of Aquinas, he says with all sorts of circumspection that perhaps the best form of government really is a monarchy, but the monarch ought to always act in consultation with people. Now, back to our situation. Aquinas was largely dealing with fiefdoms, and here in the United States, we're trying to deal with 330 million people, and it's, I think, hard to imagine what a king could do to maintain contact with requisite consultors. And prudence, of course, demands counsel, but that opens the way in our context for a whole intermediate range of governments, right on down to, let's say, the town council that Christopher Zender serves on. How could those folks be attuned to local goods so that their measures could be ordered to promoting the good rather than simply removing restrictions?
Well, first of all, before I answer that, let me just reemphasize the point you made about forms of government. Leo the 13th, who's sort of my touchstone here, said more than once that the form of government doesn't matter, provided that the government is concerned with the common good. He was even more explicit than Aquinas. So I think the notion, we just need to put behind us completely that notion that, yeah, integralists are hankering for a monarch, maybe somewhere, and maybe in some ideal way, the monarchy is the best state, but it depends so much on historical and societal circumstances that I think it's
Charles Coulomb is phoning in. He wants to have us there, but we're just not going to admit him. We won't admit him. Sorry, Charles. Go ahead, Thomas.
That's just a red herring, and we don't need to even talk about that. But as far as how to get people like Christopher to be concerned about the common good, well, I don't know. That's a tall order. A lot of it has to do with we're obviously the human race is in a fallen state, and we have even though our nature is still fundamentally good, it is very wounded and disordered. And so promoting individual virtue on the part of politicians is no doubt very difficult, just as it seems like it's hard to promote on the part of the hierarchy today. But nonetheless, that's the way to do it. Or the police, for example. How do we promote virtue on the part of the police? Well, there used to be sodalities and that kind of thing that would try to work. I don't know how effective they were or whether they even grasped the problem well, but it seems to me at least, it's a matter of virtue, individual virtue, plus, of course, the notion that has to permeate our thinking is, what is government for? Because I doubt that, I know Christopher would be able to speak eloquently on this topic, but I doubt that your colleagues, Christopher, if you asked them what's the purpose of government, they would have a very, a very complete answer. The individualism that Christopher mentioned before and that permeates our thinking is a real hindrance to right thinking about government. And thinking has to come before action. I mean, if you want to be virtuous, the first thing to do is get your thoughts in order. Americans don't like to think about this. American Catholics like that thought and virtue are really in separate compartments, but they're not. Our thinking has to be in order if our actions are going to be in order. And so when you have the kind of idea about government that flows all the way from Locke, or at least intermediately from Locke, where government is simply a means of preserving rights that pre-existed, then it's going to be hard to get people to think in terms of the common good.
Right.
All right, Christopher, your name has been taken, and I hope not in vain. But go ahead, sir.
Yeah, of course, we all know the purpose of government is to assure individual property rights, right?
Nay, sir, nay, sir. Let it not be said on this show.
Oh, I guess I'm confused then. Oh, about the role of religion. When you serve in an office like I do, you rarely, even in rural Ohio, you don't bring up religion because we don't all share the same religion, and that's supposed to be a private thing. But I mean, religion seems to be getting a bad rap in the United States lately. But isn't it the case, Tom? You tell me this. Isn't it the case in our early republic that religion was held in the highest regard? That George Washington himself said that religion is necessary for a state because it makes for good citizens.
Yeah.
Can we say isn't that what Leo XIII said himself?
And let me just quickly say that my mother again and again said, why, there's no religion that teaches you to be bad.
Yeah, that quotation from Washington's farewell address, I'm always astounded when Christians, either Catholics or Protestants, quote that approvingly, because obviously, may I read it, Jim? May I read it? Well, it's not very long. I have it here. It says, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who would labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Well, so obviously, for him, religion, and it didn't really matter what one, was simply a prop to political prosperity and to the protection of property and other good things that he liked. So he's obviously utterly uninterested in whether religion is true. It reminds me of the noble lie in Plato's Republic, where you're going to tell a lie to the citizens in order to make them more devoted to the state. So we don't care whether the religion is true. We don't even care what religion it is. Let's just promote religion. No doubt Washington was thinking in terms of some kind of Christianity, but still he wasn't interested in whether it was true or not. And for Leo XIII, it was the exact opposite. The state had duties toward God, sure, this would work for the good of the state, but it was primarily because God was the author of the state. God was the author of society. God was the author of human nature, which required the state. So they're really completely different. And Washington, as I say, I'm just astounded when people quote Washington in a favorable way when Christians do. It makes no sense whatsoever.
So we could say he was first in war, first in peace, and off the wall in political theology.
Yeah, and the fact that I mean, you can say, okay, Washington was just a deistic politician of the late 18th century, so what do you expect? But the fact that his statement is quoted over and over and over again still shows that we haven't really escaped from that. Will Herberg in that book, Catholic, Protestant, and Jew, quotes President Eisenhower as saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, but something like, our government requires a religion, and I don't care which one it is. So that's really just Eisenhower redivivus. I mean, Washington redivivus.
He wasn't familiar with Los Testigos de Jehová. He would not have embraced the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Oh, well, I don't know. He might have, if they were got numerous enough, and of course they reject the state, don't they?
It seems that rare is the government that will embrace them because they challenge governments as such. However, I want to move from what still is a dissenting body to a body that shapes the culture, and never more so than since Roe versus Wade was upended. Praise the Lord. I want to cite something from the Los Angeles Times editorial board. And unlike the New York Times that prints all the news that's fit to be print, so they say, the LA Times prints only the news that it sees fit to print. However, this is verbatim from the statement of the editorial board, verbatim. Freedom is our core value. And it goes on to say, quote, we reject overreaching moves by public authorities to control the culture or private mores. Citizens' right to privacy to decide for themselves how best to lead their lives is fundamental. It is in keeping with our Western roots to champion individual autonomy and the freedom of conscience. So they're claiming the high road, They're the ones that are interested in conscience, as is the whole heritage of the West. And that means that privacy and autonomy are kings and queens, respectively. Well, what should we say about that?
Well, in the first place, what they mean by freedom is a kind of it's basically the freedom as conceived by liberalism, the freedom to do what you want, to throw off restraints that are imposed from the outside. There are other ways of talking about freedom, but well, before I touch on that, let me just talk more about this disordered notion of freedom. It's the philosophy, starting with at least Thomas Hobbes in the around 1600, you had the notion that the original state of mankind was apolitical, the so-called state of nature. And there were differences between Hobbes' understanding of that and John Locke's understanding of that and Rousseau's understanding of that. But nonetheless, in all cases of those and other political writers at the time, the idea of mankind is essentially free to do whatever he wants by nature. Society is a restriction on one's freedom, and we ought to keep those restrictions to the minimum. Now, in the United States, Locke's version of the social contract theory is practically gospel. It's astounding how Lockean thought has so shaped American political thinking. And this is not just what we would call liberals in the United States, but what we would call conservatives. They both have, for them, they both have freedom in this disordered sense of the word as the highest good. And I think it was Frank Meyer, one of the architects of the conservative fusionist movement in the 1950s, who said, well, it's conservatism trying to conserve freedom. And so the Los Angeles Times is trying to conserve freedom too. Now, the fact that they differ about the focus of that freedom is neither here nor there, because as I said, liberals can change their mind about what they want to free themselves from, and they involve themselves in contradictions here, but they don't care too much about that. They just go on their merry way. Now, freedom can also be understood in a sense of a freedom to do what's good, the freedom to do what's right. And John Paul II talked about this in a number of places. And this is a more ordered view of freedom, or I shouldn't say more ordered view of freedom, it's an ordered view of freedom. I think sometimes Americans, when they read John Paul and he says something about freedom, they read into that our Lockean notion of freedom, instead of realizing, he's using the same word, but he means something different from what we ordinarily think of it in the United States. And as far as, I want to say, if I may, something more about, they talk about the right to privacy and so on. There is a sense, well, St. Thomas, for example, asked the question, should the state repress all evils? And he says, no. Now, I think in a sense, you can, taking that answer of Aquinas, you can begin to construct a Catholic approach to, for want of a better term, I'll call it a right to privacy. That's not really a very good term. But there is a, if the state, for example, started to say, anyone who tells a lie will be hauled to prison immediately. Well, that would be stupid. That would be ridiculous. Not just because it would be impossible, not just because it would be a tyranny, but because it would really, the state has no business doing that. So there is a certain private sphere, if you will, although I'm not totally comfortable with that term, private sphere, but there's a kind of a spirit here of the individual where the state really should have hands off and say, okay, they can stand there. We're not going to worry about it too much, at least now. But that's different from the kind of Lockean notion of privacy or freedom. But I haven't worked this out very well, but I'm sort of I've been thinking lately about how to construct a Catholic approach, the Aristotelian Thomistic Catholic approach to this notion of a private sphere, which has a different starting point from the one in American jurisprudence.
You mentioned lying. A recent study shows that 93.8% of verbally active Catholics tell lies.
That's shocking. Just shocking.
Well, we go forth. We go forth. Christopher, your thoughts?
I would think that, isn't it right, the government's limitations are going to be, I mean, what the government does has to be to realize the common good. And when the government limits itself, it does so for the common good. So, I mean, like the case of lying, there are certain sins, certain unjust acts, which you don't restrict simply because to do so would hinder people from actually, hinder subsidiary groups like the family from their competence in actually directing those sorts of activities. And would also put too many, it wouldn't allow enough, shall we say, freedom for individuals to actually exercise virtue. So, I mean, in that sense, the negative freedom is important because it does give us the ability to actually exercise the freedoms we ought to exercise and to learn virtue in that way. Would you say, I'm trying to think of a sense how people understand negative and positive freedom. And could we understand negative freedom in this way? Negative freedom is sort of like being tied to a chair and being forbidden to walk. I mean, not being tied to a chair, being free, allowed to walk. Positive freedom is the actual ability to walk. So someone who is crippled, for instance, does not have the freedom to walk, even though he might have the freedom to walk in the sense nobody's hindering him from walking, but yet he doesn't have the ability. And this goes the same thing with virtue. True freedom is virtue because we have the ability to do as we ought to do. We have the ability to do what we need to do in order to attain, union with God. Do you think that is a way of understanding?
Yeah, that's certainly, I mean, as I said, this question of how to construct a Catholic theory of what you called negative freedom is something I've just started thinking about. So I'm not prepared to pronounce anything with finality on it. But yeah, those what you said is helpful, would be helpful in thinking about this. Leo XIII devoted an entire encyclical to freedom, libertas, and he started out with freedom of choice that we have, or what we usually call free will, and pointed out that that's the foundation of any kind of freedom. And it's funny because someone chained in a prison, say in a dungeon 10 miles underground, is free in that sense, just as much as somebody who's walking around the city. Nobody can force you to do anything, can force you to think anything, even though they can carry you around and chain you up. So that fundamental notion of freedom, or not a fundamental fact of freedom, I should say, is always operative unless somebody has drugged you or something like that, or brainwashed you or something like that. But how that works out in the political sphere is something very, very different. And the Lockean political tradition has never thought about it very deeply or very soundly.
Which is not surprising, because I think the Lockean political tradition was all about a certain freedom for a certain class, right? Ultimately,
yeah, it's about the property class to keep control of their property, and it doesn't really matter as long as you're willing to. Locke says, if a heathen doubt of both testaments, and he's willing to not bother my property, why should I care? So the sense that there's any kind of good in society from holding to the true religion is just absent in Locke completely. As long as this heathen is willing to obey the law and not bother Locke's property.
Here's a question. I think this is the question some people listening to this podcast might ask. What you say about the role of religion and the role of the state, relation of state to religion, in this case, when Leo XIII is talking about religion, right, he's talking about the true Church of Christ. He's not talking about any other, not just God in general, acknowledging God, but actually acknowledging God according as God wants to be acknowledged, and that's in the Catholic Church. Aren't you kind of aren't you and Leo going against the latest instantiation of the magisterium, namely Vatican II? I mean, hasn't Vatican II actually said that there is endorsed the liberal notion of religious freedom?
Well, that's certainly commonly said.
Yeah,
and it's a big topic. Jim, you'll have to have me on again to talk about Dignitatis Humanae for an hour, because we could go on at least an hour. But basically, let me just say no. The document of the Second Vatican Council, Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration of Religious Liberty, is, I would say, first of all, it has to be, if the prior teaching, the teaching of Leo, and in fact up through Pius XII and even John the 23rd, if that teaching is authoritative, even infallible by virtue of the ordinary magisterium, then we can hardly interpret Vatican II as being in contradiction to that teaching, unless you want to discard Vatican II, which I think is totally not the right way to go. So we have to figure out, can we interpret, without doing violence to the text, can we interpret Vatican II's document in accordance with Leo XIII and others? And I have argued more than once, yes, we can, and in a reasonable manner. And this book that Jim mentioned in the beginning, my book, Foundations of the Catholic Political Order, which the second edition just came out from Arouca Press, I have a detailed argument to this effect. But let me just very, very quickly summarize it. At the beginning of the Vatican II Declaration, it explicitly states that this document does not overturn previous teaching on the duty of individuals and societies toward the true religion. There you have a kind of a fundamental controlling statement for the whole document. So then you look at the rest of the document, and can without, as I said, without doing violence to the text, can you interpret it according to Leo XIII? I think you can. And it's interesting too that if you look at, and I talk about this in the book, if you look at the New Catechism, or well, not new anymore, but the 1990s Catechism of John Paul II, its statements about religious liberty are more or less in line with what the interpretation I'm giving. In fact, it even, really weirdly enough, it even has a footnote in which they reference the encyclical of Pius IX, Quanta Cura. What was that encyclical? It was the encyclical that accompanied the Syllabus of Errors, the covering letter for the Syllabus of Errors. So it's really pretty funny when you think about that. the syllabus of errors nowadays is an embarrassment to so many people. But here we have Quanta Cora being cited as an authoritative reference in the Catechism.
You know, Tom, you've helped us clarify a number of things and helped us begin at least to weave together a lot of loose threads. So we have time for one more connection though. True or false? True or false? Pope Leo XIII gave rise to distributism.
Well, no, he didn't give rise to it. It goes back to the Middle Ages.
True or false, with a friendly amendment. Pope Leo XIII directed our attention to the ever vibrant tradition of distributism as an alternative to the hated categories of conservative, liberal, left and right, etc.
Yes, I could endorse that.
All right. And how did he do that? How did he do that? That wasn't in some footnote, was it?
No, that was, well, the encyclical that everybody remembers of Leo, or Rerum Novarum, was specifically about what was it, the rights and duties of labor and capital, I think is the formal title, something like that. It's talking about how the economic order is part of this common good, part of this. If you're going to have the whole society understands the whole society with reference to God and the true church, then the economic order is a very, very important part of that. And so Rerum Novarum seeks to place the economic order within that framework. And as I said, the Leonine revival didn't end with the death of Leo. It continued and kind of petered out in the 1960s. But Pius XI in the 1920s and 30s was even more, on the purely economic questions, he was even more remarkable than Leo. He extended and deepened and clarified Leo's teaching in a remarkable way. I mean, if Catholics could see what was in Pius XI, a lot of American conservative Catholics would blow their top. I mean, he's so critical of the free market. He's so critical of capitalists and impugns their motives and all kinds of things like that. It's wonderful stuff.
Amen to that. Now, you know, and I know, and Christopher knows, that the American Solidarity Party has been called the party that reads the papal encyclicals. The party that reads the papal encyclicals. I wonder, as we come to the close of the hour, Tom, if you could tell us some other good things about the American Solidarity Party.
Well, it's attempting, however, tentatively and imperfectly, is attempting to bridge this, what it seems like Americans regard as a fact of nature, namely that you have two blocks, and we think of them as political blocks, but in fact, they're really cultural blocks, conservatives and liberals. And they're political cultural blocks, or cultural political blocks, better. And are you a conservative or are you a liberal? Oh, maybe you're a moderate, maybe you have some of each. Well, this is such a stupid way of approaching these questions. So the ASP is trying to say, wait a minute, just because I'm in favor of protecting the environment doesn't mean that I'm in favor of abortion. Or just because I'm against abortion doesn't mean I'm in favor of fundamentally unfettered capitalism. And that, however often we say that, it doesn't seem to make much of an impression on people who talk about public opinion in the United States. Journalists can't seem to get beyond that. I mean, even somebody, if I can mention him, even somebody who I think is many ways a thoughtful man, Rod Dreher, just does not seem to be able to get beyond that liberal conservative left-right divide. It just seems to be fundamental to his thinking. Whereas if he would see how shallow that is, it would actually help him to advance what he claims, at least, are some of his ideas. Whether how serious they are, I don't know. But I don't mean to just talk about him. But he's an example of somebody who just can't get beyond that ridiculous dichotomy.
It's a strange world, Thomas. The candidate in Chicago, well, no, it's in Chicago, but Illinois' first congressional district, the candidate backed by the American Solidarity Party, Pastor Chris Butler, lost, did his very best, been campaigning for over a year, lost. To whom did he lose? Son of Jesse Jackson. Names count, right? And who endorsed Jackson Jr.? Who endorsed him? Well, a fellow named Bernie Sanders and another fellow whose name is not a household name, but is a cryptocurrency billionaire, who pumped $500,000 into nauseating TV ads in the last few weeks of the campaign. So, as if we didn't know, the battle is an uphill battle, and our opponents are on every side. With those thoughts, however, our motto remains, siempre adelante con juicio, always forward with judgment, and our judgment is written in God's word, and so as always we end with the gospel for the day from Matthew. When Jesus went into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter said in reply, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus said to him in reply, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my heavenly Father. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thanks so much, John, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Join us this hour. And the next time we run this program, a fellow named Peter K. will be joining us.
Peter Kwasniewski.
Yes, I knew it was that. I just wanted to see if you knew. Of course you did. And we'll just tell them going into it that temperance is one of the cardinal virtues. Look at Christopher Zender smiling up there in the corner. All right, seriously, Tom, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And by the way, for this first time, Ohio has been had the majority representation on this show.
Yeah.
Wow, dangerous precedent. All right, take care, guys.
Great. See you later.
All right. Bye. Thank you.